The city had always thrived on the edge of darkness, its sprawling streets a labyrinth of neon lights and crumbling infrastructure. Beneath the surface, in the veins and arteries of the metropolis, lay the forgotten world of the sewers. It was a place where light dared not intrude, a domain of stench and shadow where only the most desperate ventured. And yet, it was there, in the bowels of the city, that something far worse than desperation had taken root. They called it the Burrower. No one knew exactly when the stories began, but whispers of a creature lurking in the sewers had circulated for years. It was said to be an abomination, a monstrosity that defied the laws of nature. The descriptions varied. Some spoke of it as a giant insect with the claws of a crab and the body of a worm. Others claimed it was a demon, a punishment for the city's sins. But one detail remained consistent: the Burrower had an insatiable hunger for human flesh. At first, the disappearances were sporadic, an occasional homeless person vanishing without a trace, a missing child whose body was never found. The city dismissed these incidents as the unfortunate consequences of urban decay. But as the number of missing people began to rise, so did the terror. The police were called in, their investigations fruitless. Search teams ventured into the sewers, armed with flashlights and weapons, but they found nothing, no trace of the missing, no evidence of any creature. The Burrower, if it existed, was elusive. But the stories continued, growing darker with each retelling. The creature, they said, could move through the tightest of spaces, slithering through the filth with a speed that defied its size. It hunted at night, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, its claws snapping shut on its prey with bone-crushing force. Once captured, the victims were dragged into the depths of the sewers, their screams muffled by the thick walls of concrete and grime. No one who encountered the Burrower lived to tell the tale. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, the attack stopped. The disappearances dwindled until they ceased altogether. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that whatever had been terrorizing them had either moved on or died. The sewers were left to their silence, and the people returned to their lives, the memory of the Burrower fading like a bad dream. But the sewers never forgot. Years passed, and the city continued to grow, expanding its reach into the surrounding countryside. New neighborhoods sprang up, their sleek buildings rising like steel and glass beacons of progress. But beneath the surface, the old sewers remained, a neglected underworld where time stood still. Few dared to venture down there anymore, and those who did returned with tales of strange sounds, of shadows that moved just beyond the edge of sight. It was during this time that construction workers began to report unusual findings. As they dug foundations for new buildings, they uncovered tunnels that weren't on any maps, narrow, winding passages that seemed to lead nowhere. The air inside these tunnels was thick with an acrid stench, and the walls were slick with a foul, oily substance. Some workers claimed to hear scratching sounds coming from deep within the tunnels, but when they shone their lights into the darkness, they saw nothing. One day, a worker named Manuel, a veteran of the construction industry, went missing. His co-workers last saw him entering one of the uncharted tunnels, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Hours passed, and when he didn't return, a search party was sent in after him. They found his flashlight lying on the ground, its beam flickering weakly, but Manuel was nowhere to be found. The only sign of him was a set of deep claw marks gouged into the walls of the tunnel. Panic spread through the construction site, and the project was halted. The authorities were called in, but they found no trace of Manuel. The tunnel was sealed, the site abandoned. But the story of his disappearance spread, reigniting old fears. People began to whisper about the Burrower again, convinced that it had returned. The city, desperate to quell the rising tide of fear, downplayed the incident, attributing Manuel's disappearance to an unfortunate accident. They reopened the construction site, continuing their work as if nothing had happened. But those who knew the truth weren't convinced. They believed the Burrower was still down there, waiting. As the construction continued, more strange incidents occurred. Workers reported hearing distant echoes of scraping and slithering sounds that seemed to come from all around them, yet nowhere at once. Tools went missing, only to be found later in places they had no business being. And then there were the sightings, fleeting glimpses of something massive moving in the shadows, too quick to be seen clearly, but unmistakably there. The city, growing ever more paranoid, increased security around the site. Guards were posted at the entrances to the sewers, and cameras were installed to monitor any activity. But the Burrower was clever. It knew how to avoid detection, how to stay just out of sight, biding its time. Then, one fateful night, it struck again. A young guard named Alex was making his rounds when he heard something unusual, a faint clicking sound, like the tapping of claws on concrete. He paused, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The sound grew louder, echoing through the tunnel. His heart pounding, Alex radioed for backup, but before he could finish his call, something enormous surged out of the shadows. The last thing Alex saw was a pair of massive claws, glinting in the dim light, snapping shut around him. His scream was cut short as he was yanked off his feet, the radio falling from his hand and clattering to the ground. The sound of his struggle echoed through the tunnels, followed by a chilling silence. When the other guards arrived, they found the tunnel empty save for the discarded radio and a trail of thick, slimy residue leading deeper into the sewer. Alex was never seen again. The city was thrown into chaos. News of the guard's disappearance spread like wildfire, and soon everyone was talking about the Burrower. Panic gripped the populace, with people refusing to leave their homes after dark. The sewers were sealed off, and the construction site was abandoned once more. The authorities launched a massive search operation, determined to find the creature once and for all. But the Burrower remained elusive, vanishing into the labyrinthine depths of the sewer system. Weeks passed, and the city's fear slowly turned to resignation. The Burrower was a specter, a phantom that could not be caught or killed. The search teams were called off, the sewers left to rot in their own darkness. But the people of the city were forever changed. They no longer looked at their streets with the same casual indifference. Every manhole cover, every storm drain, became a potential gateway to terror. The Burrower, it seemed, had won. But then something strange happened. The attacks which had terrorized the city for so long suddenly stopped. No more people went missing, no more claw marks were found in the tunnels. The city, wary but hopeful, began to breathe easier. The Burrower, it seemed, had disappeared just as mysteriously as it had appeared. Years passed, and the memory of the Burrower began to fade, relegated to the annals of urban legend. The sewers, long abandoned, became a place of myth, a forbidden zone where only the bravest or the most foolhardy dared to venture. Life in the city returned to normal, or as normal as it could ever be, with the specter of the past lingering in the shadows. But legends, as they say, never truly die. And there were those who believed that the Burrower was not gone, merely sleeping, waiting for the right moment to return. One of these was a journalist named Karen, who had spent years investigating the stories of the Burrower. She was obsessed with the creature, convinced that it was still out there, biding its time. Karen had collected countless testimonies, pored over police reports, and even ventured into the sewers herself on more than one occasion, searching for any sign of the beast. Her colleagues thought she was crazy, a relic of a bygone era clinging to an outdated myth. But Karen didn't care. She knew the truth, or at least she believed she did. And so, when reports of strange sightings in the city began to surface once more, she knew it was time to act. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a map of the old sewer system, Karen descended into the depths of the city, determined to find the Burrower and expose the truth. The air was thick with decay, the walls slick with moisture and age. As she ventured deeper, the tunnel grew narrower, the air colder. The smell of rot was overpowering, and Karen had to fight the urge to turn back. But she pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting and turning until she was completely disoriented. And then she heard a faint clicking sound, like the tapping of claws on stone. Her heart raced as she turned off her flashlight, plunging the tunnel into pitch darkness. The sound grew louder, closer, until she could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath her feet. Suddenly, a massive shape loomed out of the darkness, its form barely visible in the faint glow of her camera's screen. Karen froze, her breath catching in her throat. The creature was enormous, its body long and sinuous, covered in a slick, chitinous armor. Its eyes glinted in the darkness, cold and unfeeling, and its claws clicked menacingly as it moved toward her. For a moment, Karen was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. But then, instinct took over. She raised her camera, snapping a series of photos, the flash briefly illuminating the creature in all its horrific glory. The burrower let out a low, rumbling growl, its claws snapping shut just inches from her face. Karen turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the creature's growls echoing behind her. She didn't stop until she was back on the surface, gasping for breath, her hands trembling as she clutched the camera. When she finally reviewed the photos, her heart sank. The images were blurry, the creature barely visible amidst the shadows. It was enough to confirm the existence of something, but not enough to convince anyone else. The burrow remained a myth, its true nature shrouded in darkness. But Karen knew the truth. The burrower was real, and it was still out there waiting. And as long as it remained, the city would never be safe. The sewers would always be a place of fear, a place where the darkness lived and breathed. And somewhere, deep in the labyrinth of tunnels, the burrower waited, its hunger never sated, its claws ready to snap shut on its next victim.